You mentioned you had some rules that you follow when looking for properties. Could you run us a bit more deeply through the methodology that you go through when searching for properties for clients?
Yeah, like I suppose I stated before, when looking at investment properties, it's quite a different tack to that of a home purchase. Obviously, we don't take into account any emotion. We look at the facts and the figures. So I'll run you through our strategy and that process now. And this really what underpins any particular acquisition that we make on behalf of clients. And it's really working back from that initial conversation. So our original portfolio review or initial consultation, we'll sit down and we will go through the client's current position and what they're trying to achieve, short, medium, and long-term goals. Once we have those in place, we can start to work it back to where they should be investing across Australia, because different situations require different needs, and depending on their appetite for yield, capital growth, risk will depend on what region we'll be buying in Australia and what suburbs particularly will be allocating an acquisition based on those sort of metrics. So once we've identified that strategy, that sort of will lead us to where we're looking on a national level, so macro research. A good example of that is having a client with a long-term strategy, where it might be an 8 to 10 year hold versus someone who's looking to get in and out of the market within a 5-year period, something that we don't typically encourage. But in that situation, they may be looking at a Brisbane market for the next 3 to 5 years versus a client more recently that we had that was looking for a long-term hold. Perth in that particular situation certainly represented more upside in terms of where it's currently positioned in its cycle. Once we've identified that, it goes through a different phase of property selection and suburb selection. So again, appetite for capital growth or exposure to capital growth versus yield is really important in understanding where and what we're buying. Obviously, strong capital growth assets, be that a development site, typically are certainly lower on the yield side of the equation. And the same is true units or properties that have a lower land to value ratio typically have higher yields or equivalent. So once we understand what that looks like, and typically there's a sweet spot with each client where they want as much exposure as they can for capital growth for a certain amount of cash injection per year. And once we get that equation right, that really enables us to focus in on particular suburbs and particular properties. Obviously, our business is very much geared towards capital growth. So we are looking for land value assets. We don't buy units, we don't buy apartments, we don't buy house and land package or anything like that. So we're always going to be notoriously focused to capital growth, but we need to understand what the cash buffer is or what the cash flow is for a particular client, because the last thing we want is them to overcommit to what a repayment is per week, per month, per year, and then they're in a situation when they have to force to sell, because that would put a lot of pressure on the asset to perform. Once we undertake that process and we know what we're buying, every property we inspect, we go through a pretty significant due diligence and valuation process, which will lead us to negotiation. Once we've got a walk-away price and the property that we're looking at meets our due diligence requirements, which isn't a lot of properties, and you'll see why in a moment, then we can begin negotiations. As soon as we get that walk-away price, we move off to the next property. As I say to clients, even in a market like this, in Perth, where there's a scarcity of properties, there are always more properties, and there's absolutely no reason to overpay in the current climate. Once we've successfully negotiated a property, that then lends itself to what works need to be done prior to letting the property. Ideally, we get early access, make adjustments to the property to activate the highest yield possible, and then we rent the property out, ideally within the first 2 weeks. And from there, with the client, my advisor and myself, the client's advisor, I should say, we catch up annually to talk through each particular property and go through an annual review to give an indication on how that property is performing, but also what they're doing with their portfolio or other assets in that portfolio. In terms of where we're purchasing in Perth, it's, we can't just go out and buy a property in any suburb, in any cap city that we see value in. It's, again, reverting back to the data is really important, making it as objective as possible. Taking the emotion out of the equation is really, really important. Where I think is a good place to live may not necessarily equate to what's going to be a good investment opportunity. So our business is very much driven by research and data. So the same is true when we're on a micro level. So even in Perth at the moment, we're buying in 35 suburbs across the board. So that's, it does make it difficult to source property, hence why a lot of the properties we purchase are off market, because when you're only looking at 35 suburbs and it's got to meet the due diligence requirements, it doesn't lend itself to a lot of property. But at the same time, these are the fundamentals that we need to meet before we make a purchase. And as you can see, as I spoke about earlier, long-term compounding growth rate in Perth 6.5, we're only buying suburbs where the long-term compounding growth rate exceeds 6%. So that's really, really important. Vacancy rate sub 1%. Online demand, so that's views per property exceeds 700. And then the other sort of points you can see, housing commission is the other. Not buying within proximity is really important, but also having a lot of established dwellings and owner occupiers within the market. It's the areas that we want to be. We want to be buying in blue chip areas where there's a lot of owner occupier appeal, because at the top of the cycle, if clients choose to sell a property, we want to be selling our properties back to an owner occupier who's emotionally fueled to buy that property and will pay an absolute premium at the top of the cycle. We don't want to be buying investment properties in investment grade areas whereby the yield is quite attractive, but the long-term growth prospects are lower to that of a blue chip owner-occupied asset. So looking at an investment report on a particular property, obviously East Victoria Park is one of our buy suburbs. Bought a number of properties here over the last 3 years, for a number of different reasons, which I won't go into too much detail now. But if you look at the local data sets, extremely strong in terms of the fundamentals. Average income has increased over the last 5 years considerably. So what that tells us is there is more money spent in the suburb. That's equating to higher, obviously, median house prices and higher surplus spend on renovations and those sorts of things. So the appetite for the suburb certainly changed a lot in the last 3 to 5 years. But we walk through each particular asset, why we like, why we don't like the asset. Obviously, proximity to amenities is extremely important. Same is true with various factors. So each investment report has a 30-point check grading system, and this runs through everything from building quality through to natural light, floor plan, flow. So this system allows us to rank property to property, and we've got a minimum requirement before we'll present a property to a client. And then working through cash flow is also equally as important, because again, it goes back to that original strategy. What's it going to cost the client per week to hold this property? And in this equation here, this is obviously working off a 5% interest rate, so they are stress tested. But if this client can't afford $250 a week to purchase this property, then we're not even considering it, because we just don't want to put those clients in, potential harm's way or a situation where they need to sell because they can't service the mortgage. Due diligence, it's arguably the most important thing we do in the purchasing process. We spend anywhere from 3 to 7 hours per property to undertake this checklist. And if any one of these particular items isn't met, we will put a line through that property immediately. So we're inspecting at the moment anywhere from 10 to 17 properties per week, of which we're putting offers in on potentially 1 to 2. And a lot of the time, it's because it fails one of these metrics. The other, of course, is price. The vendor's too aggressive on the price, we won't participate. But certainly, I'd say almost half the properties we look to purchase fail our due diligence test. And a lot of that's to do with, here in Perth, is housing commission, easements, particularly if we're looking at development sites or development upside, zoning implications. So there's been a lot in that space, a lot of changes in zoning, commercial changes, as well as higher density zoning. The last thing we want to do is buy an asset that's in proximity to a potential childcare centre or petrol station or increased density, be that apartments, townhouses. So understanding, what the highest and best use of the property is and what's located within the close proximity is vitally important. And any client that's looking to make a purchase should go through and spend some time and go through these metrics in detail, because this will ultimately impact the value of your property. Elective due diligence. So this doesn't happen on every property. This is only if we find caution to express further. So typically the most common out of this equation, electrical and plumbing audits of the request of the building inspector. Non-conforming structural uses is a big one in the western suburb or the older suburbs that we're buying in. Whether that patio or the extension was approved in the 80s or 90s is quite commonly it's not. And that may, not always does that mean we won't purchase the property, but it's understanding the cost in getting a retrospective approval or to the level of degree of what hasn't been approved. So if it's a second story addition, there's no way we would be proceeding because the cost to rectify that and the structural issues that may come as a result of not having an approved, council approved extension can cause significant issues for particular clients. The other is survey plans. So what you'll find is in the older suburbs, again, you look at Netherlands is a good one, Subiaco is another, that some of the boundary fencing has been around and has been shifted from time to time for various reasons, between friendships between neighbours to give them more access for their parking or what have you. If that fence or boundary fence has been out of line for more than 9 years, you may be in a situation where it's a forced claim. So the problem is clients typically may buy a property, not our clients, but people buying a home will buy a property and the previous neighbours have been good friends and they haven't made the potential buyer aware of the fact that the fence line has been out of balance for more than 9 years. Clients may then hold the property for a period of time before they get a letter issuing that there's a forced claim or a forced possession. So, again, not all properties, and I'm not saying that this is needed on all properties that are inspected or purchased, but something to be really careful. And what I often do is measure up the boundary fence when I'm in inspection, compare that to the survey plan that you can find on the certificate of title. And if there is a difference or a significant difference, I'll then look to revert to a survey plan. Meth testing, uncommon. It's sort of a 1 in 100 property we have done it in Perth, inspected for use and obviously that sort of behaviour within a property. And we haven't found any positive findings, but again, it's something that if recommended from a building inspector, we may need to explore, and it's just some consideration to have if that does come about. Pricing, again, vitally important, really, really essential that you're not overpaying for the property. So when looking at this, it's good to have 3 different methods. Typically, it can be hard to find comparable sales, especially in a rising market. So what's important here, if you are going out there to buy a property and you're trying to compare, you cannot look past anything that's sold further than 2 months ago because it becomes irrelevant. Ideally, you need sales within the last 2 weeks, and the majority of these sales won't have settled. So having relationships with agents to know exactly what those houses or these figures have sold for gives you that power to know exactly what that property is worth. So a lot of our comparables are properties that are under contract, that are unconditional, but haven't yet settled. And that allows us to be buoyant in the market and understand where value lies. Because if you're using 6 months evidence, you're certainly not going to be in touch with where the market's at, and you're not going to put yourself in a position to be able to buy a property. If there's limited sales evidence, obviously using a summation method is recommended, and that's determining the value of the improvements versus the land. And as a last resort, using the cash flow, so working back from the net yield and deriving a value in that format. So typically, the most important part of this process is setting a firm walk-away price. So if you're going to negotiate on a property, having a strategy, having a plan and having a price is fundamentally the most important thing you can do, and sticking to that plan. Also, although very difficult, there are some crafty sales agents in the game, but sticking to that will give you so much more power in that negotiation. Home buying and the methodology in this space is completely different to that in the investment world. Obviously, with investing, it's black and white, facts and figures, and we have a team of ex-valuers that really specialise in the investment space. Home buying is different. We've got 4 buyers agents here in Perth and 1 in South West that live in the regions that they're advising in, whether it's the Northern Beaches, whether it's Western suburbs or the South West. Our advisors live and breathe these suburbs. They have relationships on the ground. They really understand the streets and the different pockets that one may want to live. But I suppose that the methodology in this space is all around what's important to the client. And that varies from client to client. It's really subjective. So it's a role of the BA to understand what's important to you as a client, but also what's achievable. We've had problems with clients that, if they're not realistic, and we have to have honest conversations, they're going to cost themselves time in the market. And the same was really true before Christmas. We had a lot of clients that probably weren't in a position to make a decision quickly. And those clients that were looking then in March and April had probably missed out on those pockets that they were trying to achieve. Claremont was a great example. Cottesloe was a really good example of that. So it's a BA's responsibility to make sure that the clients are realistic in what they're trying to achieve, understanding their requirements and what they're trying to achieve, and setting out a strategy. And then they also have a really strong process in trying to source properties. A lot of 90% of the acquisitions in this space are off market, whether that's pre-market from agents, owner direct, rentals. We've purchased a lot of rental properties more recently. So that certainly carries a lot of weight in that space. But also that local knowledge, knowing what streets you want to be on, what streets are going to carry more weight and more value over the long term. And for a lot of our clients, it's trying to remain anonymous, not getting too emotionally involved, particularly when it comes to negotiation. So as you can see, a lot of the activity that's occurred in this space, there's been a lot of positive growth, and you can look at the vacancy rates, days on markets in the owner-occupier space, particularly in the western suburbs. We've seen a significant uplift in not only values, but certainly activity in this area. A lot to take in there, James, but I hope that you certainly get some value out of that process. It's quite in depth, but there was a recent survey that 70% of purchasers spend less than 45 minutes in a particular property, which is crazy, considering that buying a property, and we spoke about this off air, for most or for some is the biggest financial decision they'll make. Yet they'll spend at least amount of time in due diligence in making that decision. A lot of people will go out there and buy a property after a 15 to 20 minute inspection. So I don't encourage that. I do encourage you to spend the time, and if you use our templates, that's completely fine, and I do advise using that. But having a strategy really underpins that. So I'll link you back in now, James.
Oh, thanks for that, Lachlan. It's really good to see how comprehensive the process is. You've helped quite a few of our clients now with a portfolio review of the properties that they own, and I understand that service is now complimentary. Can you tell us a little bit about what's involved there, and if someone wanted to take you up on that offer, what information do you need from them?
Yeah, certainly. So it's certainly not complimentary for all clients, but for capital partner clients, it is. It's a pretty detailed process. So we do a detailed assessment on a client's portfolio or individual property. So that enables us to essentially give a buy, hold, sell recommendations on any property across Australia. So having national presence and teams across all capital cities, and they're too included in the process if we've got clients with properties on the East Coast. So that process looks at the fundamentals of the property and the property cycles and where they're at and the types of assets. So like we spoke about previously, we do buy properties for the long term, but if there is dead wood in the particular portfolio, then there may be a case to look to divest some of that, I suppose, negative equity and put that into a different vehicle or a different asset that can generate capital growth. So we've done that, and we've reshaped different clients' portfolios over the years, and more recently in Perth with 1819, reshaping some of the dead wood as we speak in portfolios across different markets in Perth, and now those established portfolios are producing good outcomes. So essentially what we require is an introduction of the assets in the portfolio or property in discussion, any sort of debt on that property, rental returns. So the more information we can have around those properties, the better. And then we can come back and have a consultation around that portfolio and our recommendation based on its performance to date and potential future performance.
Well, thank you very much for your time. Really impressive, very thorough, and also very insightful. From here, if any client or anyone else did want to be put in touch with you, what I would suggest is they speak to their advisor or contact you directly. And I noticed that your details are on the slide that we're looking at now. So on that note, thank you very, very much for your time, Lachlan, and I appreciate that today.
Thanks, James. Appreciate it.